Good evening, and welcome to our first program of the new year and new semester. My name is Jacob Begard, and I serve as Program Manager of the Common Ground Initiative here in the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. On behalf of the Hauenstein Center, Vice President Jesse Bernal and Grand Valley's Division of Inclusion and Equity, Gleaves Whitney and the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, and Brooke Clement and the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, thank you for joining us for our annual event in commemoration of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Week here at Grand Valley. Our event format this evening will begin with a leadership minute from a student in our Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy, followed by an introduction of this evening's speaker by Vice President Jesse Bernal. Chief McKinnon will then share his story of creating the change you want to see in the world, and after which Vice President Bernal will rejoin him for the question and answer portion. So, as questions come to mind, please use the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of the screen to submit them. With a new year and a new presidential administration often comes a renewed sense of hope and optimism for ourselves, our communities, and our country. A chance to wipe the slate clean and begin anew by creating a better tomorrow by doing the work today. This work cannot be done alone. This work cannot be done with hope and optimism alone. It also requires time and effort from dedicated individuals. To speak more about our mission as leaders, I would like to now introduce Elizabeth Henderson, a second-year student in the Leadership Academy and one of this year's lead fellows. Elizabeth is majoring in human resources and is set to graduate in April. Please help me virtually welcome Elizabeth.
Thank you, Jacob. My name is Elizabeth Henderson, and I'm a Cook Leadership Academy fellow candidate. I'd like to start with a quote. "The arc of the universe may bend towards justice, but it doesn't bend on its own." President Barack Obama. When I came to college, I planned to study business and to minor in anthropology and human rights. Due to this combination, I've taken classes with students who talk about the stock market for fun and with those who debate human rights policy for fun. These experiences left me wondering, who changes the world? Do the people in my human rights classes lead the way, or will it be the business students with the financial power that they'll acquire? After 3.5 years of trying to answer this question, the Cook Leadership Academy has led me to believe that it is each of us, whatever our path in life, who have the enduring responsibility to use the power, privilege, or title that we obtain to do the difficult work of bending the arc. Many of us, especially at a young age, might look at the seemingly boundless issues facing our nation and our world today and feel that we are not equipped to address them. We might prefer to set this responsibility in the laps of politicians and activists. However, in the Cook Leadership Academy, we brought together future scientists, entrepreneurs, nurses, salespeople, lawyers, academics, teachers, and many more, all with the goal of learning the skills that it will take to be a leader for equity in whatever role we end up in. With this experience behind us, we are equipped to enter our communities and workforces where we will challenge ourselves and others to be allies to the disenfranchised, not just in name, but in action. Bending the arc will take each of us, in whatever role we might find ourselves in at this moment or the next, dedicating ourselves to tuning into our moral compass and listening to the voices of those who are so often dismissed. For the 60 fellows and all of those who have come before us, we have the Cook Leadership Academy to thank for supporting us in this endeavor. My name is Elizabeth Henderson, and I am a leader. Now I'd like to pass it over to VP Bernal to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Elizabeth. You're an example of not only a leader today, but also give us hope for leadership in the future, as I know all of our Cook Academy scholars do. And thank you to the Hauenstein Center, Jacob, Brent, Allie, the entire team for your continued partnership during this important commemoration week honoring the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It's been several years now that the Division of Inclusion and Equity has partnered with the Hauenstein Center to host this event on the Thursday night of our week-long celebration and commemoration. And tonight's discussion could not be more timely. So as Jacob mentioned, I encourage you all to use the Q&A function to ask questions that will help me guide the moderating of the questions following our guest. So I'm honored to introduce Chief Isaiah McKinnon. Ike, as he's asked us to call him, began his 5-decade career in public service as an officer with the Detroit Police Department in 1965. He's held more than 10 different positions in the department before retiring as inspector to start his own security firm. In 1993, Dr. McKinnon returned to the Detroit Police Department to serve as chief And under his 5 years of leadership, hundreds of police officers were directed to go into city neighborhoods and introduce themselves to residents in an effort to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. In addition to shifting the focus of the department to community-driven policing, he advocated for and implemented training programs for officers responding to domestic violence. In 1998, he left policing and became a professor at the University of Detroit Mercy. In 2014, Dr. McKinnon was appointed deputy mayor of Detroit by Mayor Dennis Archer and served in his administration for 2 years before returning to teaching as a professor of education at the University of Detroit Mercy. Currently, he does consulting work with a Detroit-based security company. Dr. McKinnon has appeared on The Today Show, Good Morning America, Oprah, the History Channel, and other places. He holds a Bachelor's of Arts degree from Mercy College, a master's degree from the University of Detroit Mercy, and a PhD from Michigan State University. He's also a graduate of the FBI National Academy and the U.S. Secret Service School. I'm honored to welcome Isaiah McKinnon. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, and thank you for those kind words, Jess. You know, this is a very special occasion. And as a person who's done a lot of these kinds of presentations, in particular during this week, I always tell people, you know, I've had a wonderful life. It has on occasion been difficult, but regardless of the circumstances, it's been rewarding, exciting, dangerous, and educational. People say to me, they say, Ike, you don't appear to be angry, that regardless of circumstance, you tend to maintain your composure, that you smile constantly, and very seldom raise your voice. And they've never heard me swear. Well, in spite of being shot at 8 times, stabbed twice, being a cancer survivor, surviving 3 heart procedures and 2 back surgeries, I smile because I'm still here. And how many people can say they've been shot at 8 times and that whoever shot at you missed 8 times, all 8 times? That, to me, says a lot. I smile because I've lived a long life, and the countless people that have touched my life and how I try to do the same for others. The title of my presentation this evening is Policing from the Inside, which to some might make you think that you're doing some kind of undercover work. Well, that's not the case. I want to go back a few years to when we saw, or last year, we saw the video on TV of the George Floyd death. And when I saw that, I had the same feelings that had happened to me when I was a young boy of 14. I was severely beaten by 4 Detroit police officers. I was just leaving high school. And at that time, it was called Cass Tech. And those 4 officers were, for a 14-year-old, the meanest people you ever want to see in your life. But as I always say, it was that I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or the right place at the right time for them. They were yelling and screaming and swearing at me and continued to beat me as I asked them why. And the people in the neighborhood were screaming at them to stop. And eventually they did. And unlike George Floyd, they let me go. I then made this decision at the age of 14 that I was going to become a Detroit police officer. And the reason being that I wanted to make a difference in the lives of a great number of people. I'm going to fast forward to last year when I wrote the op-ed piece, George Floyd Could Have Been Me. That appeared in more than 50 American newspapers, additional newspapers in Canada, United Kingdom, Germany, and South Africa. In fact, I received a great number of calls from people around the world wanting to talk with me about what I had written. And as just said, I was on CNN, the Today Show, Good Morning America, and various international programs talking about that. Most people want to know how that could happen, but also what were my feelings. I would tell you, a man who is a professor at another university, not here, wrote me and asked me, what did I do to cause those officers to act the way that they did? And I must tell you, I was concerned because this man said, you had to do something because police officers don't just beat people up. And I said, but I was 14 years old. He said, well, 14 years old do things, bad things also. I said, but I was 14. I explained to him and to others that I made this decision at that point that I was going to join the police department. And what I want to do right now is give you a history of what makes me or made me the way that I am today, and what have I done. Like most of my family, I was born in Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama. And my father was born in 1900. He was born on a farm where both of my grandparents were born into slavery. And they were sharecroppers. But my dad would sit and talk with me constantly about his life and things that I should or should not do. And what stood out for me was the fact that he always talked about, son, there are good and bad people in every group. And I don't want you to think that everybody's bad or everybody's good. The other part of it too was my dad was this very religious man. And he would constantly tell me, have faith, not only in yourself, but have faith in other people. And so when I was 9 years old, the family moved to Detroit. And for those of you who know something about the Brewster Projects, this is infamous or famous for people like Donna Ross, Smokey Robinson, and others, Joe Louis. They all lived in the Brewster Projects at different times. And so I claim that as part of my upbringing. But as a young boy growing up in that area, it was very seldom that I would see a police officer or police officers who were like me. I think in the entire time that I was in that area, I saw two African-American police officers. But I did see a great number of police officers who made it a habit of grabbing, beating, pulling guns on young men in the neighborhood. And in fact, so many of the young men that I grew up with had the same kinds of things that happened to me that happened to them. And we would talk about this in terms of, this is wrong, but what can we do? But there's very little that could be done. And so after I was beaten up by the police, I remember I ran home and I told my mother I wanted to join the police department. I did not tell her what had happened, because back in 1957, if you as a person of color went into the police department and made a complaint, chances are you would be locked up or you'd be beaten up. And that was what happened back in that time. It was an all-Black neighborhood. Detroit was a segregated city. There were restaurants and stores and schools that you couldn't go into. But this is a fact of life. Jobs were limited to certain locations, and what we call the good jobs, where it was a mailman or a teacher, which a lot of Black people aspire to. But so many young people like myself, they aspired to go into the military, because you had that, or you had the factories that you would go and work to. Very seldom would you think about becoming a police officer. And so in 1961, I joined the Air Force, and I was there for 4 years. And I was then truly amazed at the systemic racism that I saw there in the Air Force. I couldn't believe that here we were, at first in Texas, then in North Dakota, and then to the Philippines, and finally in Vietnam. But the same things were occurring. But I said, this can't be something that's going to last forever. And so I was discharged in 1965. On August 2nd, 1965, I joined the Detroit Police Department. And I remember specifically as I joined the police department and would talk to people, there was my class had 67 people in it. 5 of us were Black. And there's very little interacting or talking amongst the people who were part of my class. And certainly, as we would go out to the precincts, certainly no one spoke with us. And those 5 of us who came back would talk about the fact that this was occurring. And so when I graduated from the police academy a few months later, my first assignment was to a precinct. Again, my assumption was that things were going to be great, that racism that I had experienced in 57 was gone, but that was not the case. As I went to my first assignment, I was the only Black person on the shift. And if you can just think about this, walking into a room that has 30 people in it, and you're the only one that's different, and no one spoke. And in fact, when we had roll call, the supervisor made it a point to mention that we have a new person, and everybody laughed. And as they went for the assignments, you would have the second precinct, was where I was assigned. And let's say you would have 2-1 for second precinct, 2-1, 2-2, those are the car assignments. And when they got to Scout 2-7, they mentioned this officer's name and my name. And they said, "You're working Scout 2-7. And I remember distinctly at that point, this officer made this terrible racist comment about who he was working with. You can just imagine he used the N-word on multiple occasions, and everybody laughed. The supervisors laughed, the officers laughed, but there I was by myself. Now, I learned later that the reason that he did that was part of an attempt to get me to quit, as they had with so many other people. And then after the roll call, I went to get into the car with the officer who had made that comment. And I said, "Excuse me, am I working with you?" He said nothing. And I repeated myself. He said nothing. I did it a third time. And he said nothing. So I walked back to the supervisor and said, "Excuse me, Sarge." I said, "Am I working with that officer over there?" He said, "Yeah, that's your partner for the night." Well, for 8 hours, we rode, and the officer said nothing to me, absolutely nothing. And in fact, he had a cardboard in between us to separate us. He used Lysol spray on the seat that I sat in, and anything that I touched, he would spray it. So that was the reality of what I faced when I joined the Detroit Police Department. And even more so was the fact that these officers would ride and they would pull up next to a person of color, whether it was Black or Hispanic, and would use racially derogatory terms to those people. And you're faced with a situation where, what do you do? Do you quit? Because if you go and talk to the supervisors, because I had seen how they responded when the person said that at roll call, there was nothing that could be done. And I was determined that I was not going to quit, that nothing was going to make me leave. So my goal became to not only stay, but to educate the other officers to what they were doing. And I would have conversations as time went on with other officers who some I'm still friends with today, who are white. And they would say to me, I don't know how you put up with it, but that was the reality of what was happening during that time. Think about this. There were 5,000 or 5,500 police officers on the Detroit Police Department and less than 50 of color. It was a very difficult and dangerous time for anyone in the police department who was of color. Well, let me say this. There's something called a law enforcement code of ethics, code of conduct. And every law enforcement officer, not only in Michigan, but in the country, has to read that and has to learn that, and supposedly to adhere to that, to abide by that. And the first paragraph says, as a law enforcement officer, my fundamental duty is to serve the community, to safeguard lives and property, protect the innocent against deception, the weak against oppression or intimidation, and respect the constitutional rights of all to liberty, equality, and justice. Now that's the first paragraph. And if you think about that, as a law enforcement officer, this is what I'm supposed to do. And I tried to adhere to that. And I would talk to officers about this. Look, you're safeguarding lives and property. You're protecting the innocent against deception, weak against oppression, intimidation, and respect the constitutional rights of all to liberty, equality, and justice. But think about this. Those officers who did not speak to me, who would say derogatory, racially derogatory terms against Black and Hispanic people, who obviously did not adhere to that code of conduct, and what were they going to do? And they would laugh at things that they would do and say. I will tell you, every day that I was at the precinct, every day, I heard a racially derogatory term that was directed towards me or someone in the street because of who they are or were. Whether it was a Black person or Hispanic person, it was a common, ordinary day thing. And you would also see officers doing things to people that you couldn't believe. And at some point, it became so important for me to step in and stop it. And I got to the point where I would say to officers, look, you're not talking to me. You're not going to do this in front of me and have me and others subjected to the kind of systemic racism that I'm seeing that others are seeing. And so I remember one officer saying, well, I won't talk to you. I mean, that was the first time he spoke to me, when he said, I won't talk to you. I said, and so what else is new? But this was common, everyday thing for so many officers. Now, I must tell you that this was not something that was specific to Detroit. This is something that, as I spoke with other officers around the country, this is exactly what was happening with him all the time. And think about this, there were the number of minority officers on each and every police department was very few. And so in 1967, we had the riot/rebellion in which there were 43 people killed. And I remember specifically, Detroit was literally ablaze. And I was assigned to a group of 12 officers with one supervisor. Everybody was quiet except for me. And understand that the area that we patrolled was a Black area, totally Black area. And we were told to arrest looters. And I remember specifically, we were driving down the street in 3 different cars. And the sergeant stops and tells everyone to get out, and there are hundreds of people on the street. If you see those old pictures of rioters and looters, this is exactly what was occurring. So the 12 of us are out of the car. We had our batons, we had the helmets that you see that's on. And this sergeant, who had to be without a doubt the dumbest person I've ever seen in my life, he said this. He said, all of you, and he used the term effing, I'm not going to use that, and he used the racial derogatory term, starts with an N, get off the street. And it's like everybody stopped. The people that were looting stopped, and they said, what did you say? And he repeated himself. And I said, oh my God, we're all going to die. And at that point, they started throwing bricks and bottles at us, and we retreated back to our cars and took off. And one of the officers who was assigned in the car with me, he said, you know, that's a dumb man. I said, well, certainly he's dumb. I said, but think about what he just said. I said, I want you to think about this in terms of something demeaning and derogatory to a great number of people. And he just used that term as if it was nothing. He said, I will never use that term again, I promise you. Well, that was just the start of things that occurred in 1967 in the riot. And it became even more important for me to try and take a stand or stance in terms of what the officers were doing. And so we had what was called the Algiers Motel incident. And there was a movie that was made about it 2 years ago called Detroit. If you can go and get that movie, Detroit, it's something you should see, because the number of people that were killed, the number of people that were injured, it was beyond one's imagination. And so the second night that I was on patrol, I was on my way home. I lived in the heart of this rebellion. And I was in uniform, and on my uniform, the lapel here, it had a 2 for the precincts. I had my badge on, and I was driving home. And as I got off the freeway and was going to my apartment, this car with these 2 white officers pulled me over. I stepped out of my car in uniform. I raised my hand and I said, "Police officer." And as I did that, these 2 officers both pulled their guns, and they said to me, as they pointed their guns at me, using the racially derogatory term, "Tonight you're going to die." I want you to think about this. Here I was, a Detroit police officer. I had been in Vietnam for 366 days and survived through it. And here I was in my city, and 2 officers who happened to be white started shooting at me. I dove back into my car and sped off as I held the steering wheel with my left hand and pushed the accelerator with my right and sped off as they were shooting at me. I got to my apartment and I called my sergeant at the station and I said, "Sarge, let me tell you what happened." And his response to me was, "Like, you know, we have some assholes here." I said, "You're telling me they tried to kill me?" Well, this is just one of the things that occurred. And you think about this in terms of, how do you respond to something like that? Or how do you continue to live? Because here I was, a couple of years on the department, shot at multiple times by these officers, stabbed by a person, and I was still alive. But yet, the sergeant who said to me, "We have some assholes out here, right? You got to be careful." Well, I was trying to be careful. But please understand that there were a great number of people who lost their lives, and nothing was being done or done to them. And the police riot in Chicago, there were people who heard police riot in LA, the Watts riot, the riot in New Jersey, the riot in New York. It was awful. It was a very difficult time. Black officers from Detroit and other communities, they left their departments because they were being treated as bad or worse than I was. But I had made this decision that I was going to stay. And in fact, my salvation became education. And so I started college in 1968. And as time went on, 11 years later, I had the PhD from Michigan State, as I would drive up there 3 days a week. But I want you to think about this. Here I was, a police officer, a minority police officer, and these were the things that were happening to me and happening to others. And you would see officers who would brutally beat someone, a Black person, and then there would be nothing done. And I got to the point where I said, enough is enough, and you're not going to do this in front of me. If you do, I'm going to lock you up. Now you think about this, as a young Black officer, there's a white officer who's beaten someone up or called someone a name, and there was nothing that's being done. And I would tell other officers about this, and they would say, "Ike, you know, you can't do that. You can't arrest a fellow officer." And of course, we're all the same rank, but the reality is that you cannot continue to let people do these kinds of things. Another Black officer who worked at the precinct, he witnessed a officer kick and brutally beat a young man, and he told the supervisor, and Ken was totally ostracized by every white officer on the department. He was transferred multiple times because he told the truth. And that's what would happen to an officer who tried to tell the truth about what was going on. And in essence, we had two police departments, one black and one white, one trying to make sure that things were doing the right way, and the other not necessarily caring. There was this older black man who was on the street as myself and my partner were driving down the street. He called this old man who was probably 70 years old over to the car, and he called him the N-word racial derogatory term. And the man who had come up from the South, I remember him saying, "Sir, yes, sir, what can I do?" And this officer told him to get his black ass over there. And at that point, it was the end for me when I told him that that's it, no more. No more will you do that, no more will you say that, because if you do, I'm going to kick your ass. And the terminology, that's exactly what I said. And this officer said, "You can't do that to me." I said, "Yes, I can, and I will. If you do that, if you continue to do that, there's not going to be this anymore." So I was at that time, I was in very good shape, and I was a black belt in karate, had been trained well. But the reality is that this was what was happening. And so fast forwarding to, as time went on, I gained rank. And in 1994, I became the police chief of Detroit. Ironically, the officer who the first night had made that derogatory term statement about me, he was still on the job. And at one of the police graduations, a young officer, his name was mentioned as that officer walked across the stage. And I remembered that from the first night. And I asked this officer, I said, "Officer, do you have a relative, or did you have a relative that was a Detroit police officer?" And she said, "Yes, my dad. In fact," she said, "he worked at the same precinct with you a number of years ago." Now, I always say to young officers, what would you do if that occurred to you? And what I did was I said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this young officer, this young female officer, her dad was a Detroit police officer that I worked with a number of years ago. I did not recite exactly what had occurred. I said, but so I'm going to have something special tonight. I'm going to have him come to stage and give his daughter her badge." Of course, the people started applauding. He came up to the stage where I was at, and he saluted me. "Good afternoon, sir," he said, which is a far cry from 1965. And he shook my hand. Now, after graduation, I would always speak with the officers. And I was in the room with this young officer, and she said, "Sir, what kind of an officer was my dad?" And the officers that I speak with, they say, "I would have told the truth." I said, "No, I couldn't do that. Why spoil it for her, because she had nothing to do with this?" I said, "Your dad was a unique officer." And she said, "Thank you." She said, "Is it possible I could be assigned to the same precinct?" I said, "Of course you could." That goes back to not holding a grudge, not thinking the way that that officer did, and going back to what my dad had told me. And what I should tell you also, that in 1991, I had the pleasure of meeting Nelson Mandela here in Detroit. And I was in charge of security for him. And so I said to Mr. Mandela, I said, "Mr. Mandela, can I speak with you? I want you to imagine Nelson Mandela's accent." He said, "Yes, young man." I said, "Sir, I have a question." "Young man, ask me." I said, "Sir, aren't you upset or angry at the white people in South Africa for imprisoning you for 27 years? He said, "Young man, why did you become a police officer?" And just imagine that accent. And I told him the story. He said, "Young man, that is a very noble thing that you are doing." He said, "But I want to tell you something. You should continue to go out and tell this story, because it's so important for people to know." He said, "So let me tell you, yes, I was upset with the people for imprisoning me for 27 years. He said, but in my heart, I wanted to kill all the white people in South Africa for imprisoning me. When in my head, I knew that was a wrong thing to do. He said, so young man, that's what you are doing. He said, so continue to do that and continue to be this responsible person that you are and make this difference in the world. And so the more I thought about that, I said I was on the right path because my dad had said the same thing. Don't let someone who has a lack of compassion and humanity for you or for other people dictate the way that you think about things. And so as I go around the country or wherever it might be and talk about whether it is police reform or the police actions, it is so important to do things from policing inside. And so when I did the op-ed piece last year, and I talked about what had occurred to George Floyd, and that could have been me. The op-ed specifically talks about a great number of things that I would suggest in terms of law enforcement, which I think is so important. If you're going to do policing from the inside, the number one thing you have to do is be mindful of the kind of people that you recruit into law enforcement. Because so many people go into this field with a different understanding and idea about what they should do, serving and protecting the people. But if you see and don't have a respect for humanity of people that you are respecting, as a law enforcement officer, these are my fundamental duties. And you must understand that you do that. Secondly, as you look at this in terms of the people that are recruited, there should be a continued or regular watch on what they are doing. For instance, what I would do is I would look at what's called the activity log sheets. And the activity log sheets tells you the kind and the number of people that are being stopped or arrested by respective officers. I could see that the only, or a great number of people that were being arrested by certain officers were people of color. And if you would go, and I ask you to do this at your time, go into a courtroom within your community or other communities, and you will see the majority of the people that are either arrested or given tickets are people of color. And I've seen this around this country. So there's something that's there in terms of this systemic problem that we have. So number one is making sure you recruit the kind of people that are going to uphold the laws equal and fairly. Secondly, making sure that you monitor those people who are becoming or have become law enforcement officers. Thirdly, we want to make sure that we have people that are educated. For instance, the majority of this, about 860,000 law enforcement officers in the United States of America, 330 million people. And of that 860,000, most of them have a high school education or GED. Not to demean that, but the reality is, I believe that, as I think you have a program that deals with law enforcement, criminal justice, officers should go through and have minimally 2 years of college, and after 5 years have a degree. I think that's so important because you get to know and understand other things there and about people. And I think also that we have to look at the kinds of actions that police officers take. For instance, in domestic calls, wouldn't it be great to have a social worker or someone to respond with an officer? For instance, when we were young officers, we had no training, and officers were told to respond to a call and do what you had to do, literally kick their asses. And those are the words that were told to us. And what we would do, and I was one of those officers because I didn't know, you would take, in Detroit, we have what's called Belle Isle. It's an island in the middle of the river here in Detroit. It's about 5 miles from where I worked. You would take the husband there and drop them off at the Belle Isle and make them walk home. And they would be even angrier when they got home. So making sure that you have the right kind of people, make sure that they're trained, and make certain that those people that are promoted don't maintain or manifest the same kinds of lack of humanity or ideas that's going to make have a negative impact upon your city or your police department. There's so many things that must be addressed as law enforcement people. And that is one of them is having a yearly mental health check of every officer on your department. Because at some point, they might reach that point where they've lost that humanity for people. And if you are able to have the right people come in and do a mental check of your officers, I think it would remedy or relieve some of the problems you have within your respective department. Now, I can keep talking and keep talking, but I know I've talked now for about 35, 40 minutes or so. And so what I'm going to do is stop and let's go for some questions with you guys. Okay, so let's go.
Thank you, Dr. McKinnon. And thank you for being so genuine and open about your experiences, and your optimism is resonating through your talk, and also sharing your story and history. So as you can imagine, we're receiving lots of questions. Some certainly are about your specific experiences, your journey, your work, but also as an expert in law enforcement and safety. I'm seeing lots of individuals also interested in your broader thinking on systems of policing, its culture, policy, criticisms of the institution. So I'm going to take some liberty with some of these questions, but also, your perspectives on some of the feedback that we're receiving from folks would be really helpful. So let's start with this. You talked about things like police training, community-based policing, more scrutiny in the promotion process, mental health checks, and other measures. What do you think is the first step communities have to take in tackling criminal justice reform at the local level, and how do we begin to rebuild or build trust between the police and the communities that right now may not trust the police?
There has to be, number one, communication, because people for years, in particular minority communities, have felt that they were treated poorly or unfairly by law enforcement officers. So there has to be some dialogue. And to me, it has to start with the law enforcement people, whether it's the police chief or the mayor within that, or the city manager within that respective community. But each and every officer has to understand that his or her life might depend upon how they treat someone. I lost 4 officers during my tenure as chief. And probably each and every one of those, I can safely say that it was not through something that they did or said to someone. But I think I wrote this book called In the Line of Duty a number of years ago, which chronicled every law enforcement officer in the history of Michigan that was killed in the line of duty. And I looked back as I was doing that research at the things that occurred. And I'm not blaming every officer, but we have to think about how they responded to certain kinds of situations, what you said. And so there has to be dialogue with the community. There has to be an understanding with law enforcement officers that they have to take it upon themselves to learn about the respective community. You treat people humanely. And I'm going on here, but I told this story this morning. The year that Dr. King was killed, I was on patrol with some other officers. And the densest and most dangerous part of Detroit, we were on patrol. And I saw a stolen car, and the jump man jumped out of the car and took off running. And I took off chasing him. I knew I was going to catch the guy. At the time, I was quite fast. And I chased him into an apartment building. And as I got into the apartment building right behind him, there were 3 guys, all armed with AK-47s. And they pointed the AK-47s at me and him, but me. And I'm going to say the lead bad guy was in the middle. He said, "Let him go." And I said, no, I had my gun out. I said, no, I'm not going to die today. No. He says, "Let him go." And I had him around the neck. And as I backed out of the apartment, I kept waiting for the shots to start. And I backed out onto the porch and into the street. And I was in the middle of the street looking for my partners. And these guys, 3 guys walked out with their guns trained on me and kept saying, "Let him go." And at that point, this crowd of people, they came out and one of the people yelled, "Let him go." And the lead bad guy says, "That's right, let him go." And the person who was part of the group, he says, "No, no, 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 no. We mean Officer Ike. Let Officer Ike go." And at that point, the man said, "Let him go because he's a good officer. He treats us fairly." And at that point, the three bad guys took off running away, and I still held that man. And I remember I said to the crowd, "Thank you, number one, but why did you do that for me?" They said, "Because we can't lose good officers. I mean, you have treated us fairly. You don't dehumanize us. And this is what we need in the police department. This is what we need in the community." And I share this story because it's the truth. And I want every officer to understand that so much depends upon how you as an officer or as a supervisor treat your community or treat the people within that respective community. It's not us versus them, it's all us.
Thank you. So folks are interested. Can you share a little bit more about your experience being the first Black police chief in Detroit, and how did the Black community view you as being a Black law enforcement as a Black law officer within the force during that time?
Well, let me take a step back. I wasn't the first Black police chief.
Okay.
I was the third, actually. Chief Hart was the first one. Unfortunately, Chief Hart went to jail for stealing money, and Stan Knox was the second. But as a young police officer on the Detroit Police Department, I caught hell. The name calling, "You're an Uncle Tom, you're a sellout." And the second part of that was some knew that I had, because there's a story about it, I had been in Vietnam. And I caught double hell, because here I was a person who had been in the military in Vietnam, and I was a Black police officer. And all they saw at that time was this Black guy riding with white guys. They didn't know what I was going through, these guys not speaking to me. They didn't know how I was trying to stop things from occurring. But no, I caught hell, literally. And as chief, it was different, because they had gotten to know me, the community, and they loved and respect, and still do respect.
Thank you for that. So thinking a little bit about the future, and given that policing and police, in lots of perspectives, you shared this as well, is inherently racialized in our society in the U.S. context. What do you think, or what should the future of police work look like? And can we ever move past this, or do you think that can be reformed?
There's a couple major problems. Number one, we have these serious racial problems within the United States, within America. And recognizing those problems is part of the problem of law enforcement, because they mirror society. Whether it's a Black officer or a white officer, we all mirror society. And so there has to be a realization that here are these problems as existing, and how do we as law enforcement officers treat people fairly? How do we treat them with respect? And until officers or communities understand that, it's going to continue to be that. For instance, let's look at whether it's George Floyd or other people that have been shot. It's a disproportionate number of minorities that are either in jail or being shot or locked up. And so we as law enforcement officers have to understand that. And so once we get to that, you get people to want to not only respect, but help you within the respective community. Those of us, let me give an example. I was at a meeting at the White House about 3-4 years ago, and there were 200 and some chiefs, mayors, deputy mayors there. And we were talking about how do we deal with the problems we have in our society. And I got up and I told the story that I told you guys about being beaten up by the police, and secondly, being shot at by my fellow officers. And I said, it's up to us in law enforcement to make this difference. We're not going to change 330 million people, but those of us in law enforcement, if we want to, number one, protect ourselves, and we want to protect our fellow officers, here's what we have to do to make a difference. No one said a thing. No one said a thing. These are the leaders of respective communities. And I ended by saying, listen, guys, it's up to us to make this difference. We're not going to change 330 million people, but we have to understand what's best for all of us and for our respective communities. No one said a thing.
Thank you for that. So, over the years, as you served as a police officer, either in Detroit or nationally, was there ever a point where you saw a decline in the number of racial incidents or incidents of discrimination that was occurring in the police system? What motivated that? And can there be opportunities to capitalize on those moments, or has it been pretty consistent and persistent?
Well, there are certain instances that occur that will stop certain things from occurring. For instance, during, was it last year after the George Floyd situation, there are a great number of disturbances that occurred around the country. And there was a officer who had taken down this man on the street, and he was getting ready to, this white officer getting ready to arrest him. And another officer came up and put his knee on that man's neck. I remember the one officer, he said, "What the hell is wrong with you?" He says, "Get your blanking knee off this man." He says, "I'm not going to go to jail for you." This was on TV that you could see and hear this. And I said, there are things that are changing, because I would never have seen that 10, 15 years ago. The reality is the acceptance of some officers that things are changing, and they have to make sure that they are not part of the problem, but part of the solution. So there are certain things that occur. But each and every department, each and every city has to recognize the fact that we have a problem. We do have a problem. For instance, I was doing an NPR show a few months ago, and there were two other people that part of the show. One was a Black female sergeant, retired from the LAPD. She was 20 years my junior. And the third person was a Black sergeant from Cleveland. He was 40 years my junior. And as we were talking, we all had similar experiences. So 40 years ago and more to today, we're all talking about the same thing. So there has to be a realization that here's what we have to do, and that's everyone. There's a understanding there cannot be a lack of humanity, because when you do that, it disturbs everything that you're trying to do within your respective community. And that's a reality of what we're dealing with.
So, speaking of George Floyd, the activities of last summer, how did those activities and activism then differ from what was experienced in 1967 in Detroit and other places?
Well, in those places, they were looting, and there wasn't that kind of an incident that set it off. In Detroit, it was what was called a blind pig. But what I saw in Detroit were thousands and thousands of people looting. And it was, to me, it was the chance to get something for nothing. What's occurred recently is there are people who are mad as hell. They are really mad, and they don't see the changes or what's necessary to make a difference within their respective community. And what they have seen, if you go back to, you guys are young, but the Rodney King situation, where he was severely beaten by X number of police officers with sticks. And now you're seeing people being shot, you're seeing people being beaten, and they're seeing it on TV, and they're mad as hell. And so what I say to officers, listen, you don't want to be the lead story on the 5, 6, or 11 o'clock news, because if you get involved in something, unless it's your life that's in jeopardy, don't do it. Is it worth it? Is it worth it to take someone's life for something that is not considered a felony crime, or your partner or a person in the street is not in danger? But unfortunately, we have people, and I've heard officers say this, if he runs, I'm going to shoot him. And it doesn't make any sense. Is it necessary to do that? And you have to make a judgment. It's a quick judgment call, but you make that decision. I never shot anyone, and thank God I didn't, but I was shot at. And it became part of my life to catch someone. And I took pride in the fact that I was able to run and catch them. Some had guns or whatever it might be. And I was trying to be aware of that also. But the reality is that not using fatal force. Is it necessary to use fatal force on someone? No.
Thank you. So continuing really on lots of questions about sort of the BLM movement and some of the activities that happened in the summer. And, lots of folks have been critical of the police departments who they saw protecting property over protecting individuals over the summer. Can you comment on that and your reflection on that and that perspective?
It goes back to, as a law enforcement officer, my fundamental duty is there someone that's being seriously or severely injured by what someone is doing? We know it's against the law to break into someone's business, home, or whatever it might be, but is it worth it when you're out in the street trying to protect the people of a community and your business and so forth to do what some are doing? And then it becomes a situation where the people in the street understand that you're going to do this. And so they start locking people up. And what I continue to look at is, are some things worth it? Is it worth it? And some are not. And certainly we don't want to lose everything. We don't have fires every place. But having that relationship with the community, where there are certain people can go out and talk with them, can have a better understanding or relationship with the people that you are policing. If they respect you, they're going to respect the community, they're going to respect the police department, and they sure as hell aren't going to do all the things, some of the things that we've seen. I think that's so important. But we will always have some individuals who will go above and beyond to cause problems because there are things that they want, and they will disturb and raise holy hell to get things going.
Thank you. So one of the things that a couple of the themes that came from the activism that's occurred over the last year has been the defund the police movement in many of our communities, and separately, I know these aren't connected, but also the slogan "all cops are bad," which has been placed in lots of communities as well. Can you share your perspectives on those two themes?
My growing up, I would have said the same thing based upon what happened with me and what I saw. But the reality is, I know that all cops are not bad, but I think that there are things that police officers have to do, or the kind of calls that they're responding to. There has to be a difference in what they're doing. For instance, having a social worker or a person who handles certain kinds of calls with them, not responding to certain kinds of calls for police officers that could cause, could elevate the situation for what it is. And so, yes, there's going to be that problem, but there has to be a not defunding of the police in general, but a movement of funds from certain areas in law enforcement so that we can either hire more or we can do more training. Think about what I've been talking about. Most police officers, if you talk with them, they would say, hey, listen, lock them up. Well, that's not the case. It's more important for them to understand what has to be done within your respective community to make a difference with them, with you, and within their respective people. Because, the police aren't the solution to all the problems. They aren't. And there has to be an understanding of what can be done to make a difference within a respective community.
So a few questions about sort of, rules and sort of policies around policing. Widely, policing is decentralized in the United States. What are your thoughts on sort of federal rules and laws that enact police reform instead of what's happening sort of on a local level today?
I think there should be a national standard for law enforcement. There's a national standard with the FBI, national standard with the Secret Service, Homeland Security. There should be a national standard for law enforcement officers that they all receive the same kinds of training. Once you do that, it'll make things so much better. Officers are not trained properly or have education, and they really don't know. I mean, listen, I was at the FBI Academy. I'll never forget this. This guy was a sheriff in a rural community. And we were talking about the Miranda case of the regular silent, of this, all those kinds of things. And this sheriff in this rural community, he raises his hand, and there were 60 people in that class. He said to the FBI instructor, he says, "Excuse me, Mr. Rissler," he says, "who's this Miranda fellow?" He had never heard of, nor been educated to the Miranda case, or some other cases. And see, that's important to know and understand, that there has to be a national standard for law enforcement officers. I think that once we do that, we can remedy some of the problems. Officers have to be in good shape too. I mean, here I am in my 70s and probably in better shape than some of the people that I see out the street with these huge bellies, and they refuse to get in better shape to either chase someone or not beat someone. Those are the kinds of things that have to be looked at. You know, if we have that national standard, right? In the military, we had what's called the 5BX, 5 basic exercises, that we had to adhere to every year. And every police officer, in my opinion, should have to pass a test to see if he or she is in great shape. We go once or twice a year to the range to learn how to shoot, but we don't do that for training, and that's important. The other part of that too is to make sure that the supervisors do the same thing, and that they monitor what their officers are doing. And the other part of that is we should not promote people who have a vast number of complaints against them. Well, they will say, well, you know, these complaints were unfounded. Who made them unfounded? You know, who did the investigations? And we see this. Look at all these officers that we've seen on the news. They will tell you the officers had 15 or 20 complaints against them. Well, they were unfounded. But who found them? And who found them unfounded? Those are the kinds of things that have to be looked at as we bring people into this field.
So thinking about sort of regulations and standards, I know we have some county and city administrators from across the state on that have joined us. How important do you think the designation, I think it's CALEA, the accreditation for law enforcement agencies, how important do you think that accreditation standard is for law enforcement agencies today? And is that a standard that many law enforcement agencies should be following?
Oh yeah, there's no question. It's the same as having this national standard. If you have this national standard that's recognized and it's published and people know that, I think we rid ourselves of some of those people who just got in, or can't necessarily. Well, I knew officers who had problems writing. And think about this when they go to court and the way that they express themselves in court. Well, a good attorney just rips them apart. Or how do you go about testifying in court? Or whatever it might be. Those standards are important to what you're going to do for your respective community and for your department, and to help you in terms of your safety and escalating or improving your ability to grow within your respective department.
So thinking more nationally, everybody witnessed some horrific activities on January 6th with the insurrection at the Capitol, and lots of folks are commenting, it's left people afraid, feeling hopeless. In terms of sort of national sentiment right now, how do you think these sort of feelings of hopelessness around changes in some of our institutions can be addressed?
it's a difficult situation because there are a great number of people who feel as if things are so bad, what can be done? But what we have to, I think, we have to get to the point of understanding. There's a singer by the name of Pete Seeger, a number of years ago. His favorite expression was, "This too shall pass." And I think that what we saw in Washington, D.C. and other places, there will always be a fringe group that's going to do certain things. But the realization is that most of these 330 million people in the United States are good people, and they're not going to do that. And we have to keep pushing and trying, but we also have to keep telling the truth about what's going on and make people understand that there's certain things that we will tolerate, things that we will not tolerate. And some of those things that we've seen in the last months or so have been so egregious. It's beyond our imagination that would ever happen at the Capitol or any Capitol.
Continuing a little bit on what we've been witnessing recently, President Biden's inaugural address, he focused on the idea of unity. What does that look like in a country where you've described, right? There's systematic racism in many of our institutions. There's police violence, particularly against people of color. What does unity look like in sort of that state of our nation?
Well, the unity is looking at each and every one as a human being, as a person. But unfortunately, that's not the case with a great number of people. Just because I'm Black doesn't mean that I'm going to do something worse or bad than someone else. I remember I was talking to Dr. King's son, who told the story of his dad was approached by this very wealthy man who said, "Martin," he says, I'm going to try and change the world." He said, "I'm a billionaire. I'm going to try and change the world." And Dr. King looked at him and said, "Yeah, well, that's great. You can do that." So this man set out to change the world with his billions of dollars. And I guess it was a few months later, he called Dr. King and he said, "The world's too big, too many problems. I can't change the world. Let me try and change the United States." So Martin said to him, "Well, that's good. Try it." And so, of course, as Martin, his son, told me, he said that a few months, the person gets in touch with Dr. King again. He said, "Man, the United States is too big." He says, "I can't do that. Let me try and change Illinois." And of course, that was too big too. And he then asked Dr. King, "What should I do?" And Dr. King said to him, "Maybe you got to change yourself." And so this is what I say to people. Look at yourself in terms of things that you're doing or not doing, and make sure that you are a part of a good group that's trying to make a difference and change within the world. And I think that's what we have to look at. What am I doing? What am I not doing? Are there good or bad things that's going on that I can be an active person to make a difference in the world? And that's what I try and do. I think others should try and do also.
So we have lots of questions about sort of your personal ethic around this and your sort of genuine optimism given your personal history. But before I get there, there's lots of questions, and I know this is many of these are controversial, but lots of questions about police unions and your perspectives on police unions, right? The perspective that they protect biased officers, the perspective that they really emphasize responding to protecting officers who commit violent crimes versus other incidents. What are your thoughts on that, the role of unions? And do you think unions can play a role in providing accountability for policing, or do they do that?
I'm really glad you said that, because, and the questions that are there. Look, I was in unions as a police officer and as a supervisor and so forth. As an educator, I was in unions. But unions have to look at themselves and say, what are we doing? And because the community, they see an officer who's been involved in X number of shootings, for instance, 5 or 6 or 10 shootings, and the person is still on the job, or a officer who's beaten someone up, the person is still on the job. And I know it's part of what they're supposed to do is protect their union members, but they have to understand also that someone like that jeopardizes not only their safety, but also the way that people within the respective community views them. They would say that exactly what you just said. They are protecting these officers who are biased. They're protecting these officers who beat people up, and they should not be on the job. Now, of course, that's what unions do. And so unions have to have some kind of understanding and agreement that, look, we have some bad guys. And I will tell you, there are people in the union when I was chief who came to me and said, Steve, listen, we got some crazy guys out here, and they shouldn't be on the job for a number of reasons. And they are going to not only hurt themselves, but potentially hurt some of our fellow officers. And they would say, listen, in terms of penalty, you might want to use this penalty and it will help all of us. I'm not saying that they have to do this in every case, but unions have to accept part of the responsibility in terms of how and who they represent. I think for in Minneapolis, they are not representing this officer who killed the man. I should tell you, I've been consulting with the Minneapolis City and Police Department on something called one-to-one. And what we do is I go in and have a meeting with the people who are police, are going to be police officers, and they assign a police officer to a young person who's not who is within the respective community, and that person will work with that officer for a year and get to know them. And it's a step that no one has taken before. We've been doing this now for 2 years.
That's great. So a few personal questions. Lots of folks are saying that your story, and it did demonstrates resilience in the face of adversity being the bigger person when, it's tough for a lot of us to hold our emotions in when we can be so angry, and some of the experiences that you've talked about. One of our guests, is the son of a current DPD officer. Can you share more about how you developed this resiliency? You talked a little bit about this in the story with your father, and how others, particularly people of color, continue to develop resiliency in the face of some really horrific experiences that we experience in many institutions.
Well, there are so many similar stories. And let me tell you this one. My dad, my brother, and I were driving to Montgomery, Alabama. I was 13 for my grandmother's funeral. We had gone to the funeral, and on our way back, it was probably 1 or 2 in the morning. And this car with these 6 young white men pulled up next to us and started throwing bricks and bottles and hitting our car, and the name calling. And of course, my dad, he said, I'm going to outrun them. So my dad's speeding down the highway. And of course, they're speeding next to us. I mean, it was just incredible. And we literally came to a fork in the road. And we went right, and they went left. And there was a Shell gas station there my dad pulled into. And as we did that, these guys came back. And they got out of their car with the name calling, and they had the bricks and sticks and telling us they're going to kill us. So my dad, he gave me there was a baseball bat that he always carried in the car. He said, son, you carry this. And my brother, he gave him a tire iron. He said, now listen, here's what we're going to do. He said, I will protect you. Do not swing wildly, I will protect you. And at that time, 4 white soldiers came out of the gas station. 4 white soldiers in uniform. And they said to these 6 young men, what the hell are you guys doing? And these guys said, we're going to kill these. And they use the N-word. And these soldiers said, no, you aren't, because we're going to fight with them. We're going to help them. And of course, these guys called them names too. But the guy says, we don't care. We're going to fight with them. And these 6 young men took off. My dad at that point thanked them, these 4 men. He said, "Why'd you guys do this? You didn't have to do this." And they said, "Because they were wrong. And no one should do that to anyone." And again, we thanked them. And then we got in our car, and as we drove away, my dad repeated to me, he said, "Son, see, what did I tell you? There's some good and bad people in every group. And I want you to remember that." And that has stayed with me to this day. I tell my 2 sons the same thing, that we cannot put everyone in that same category, that we have to be understanding and forgiving and smart enough not to do some of the crazy things that other people are doing. My resilience is that I've seen good people, I've seen bad people, but I never, ever, ever take that position myself. To me, it's so important. And I try and educate people that same way. And whether it's my students at the university or the students of the police officers that I've taught around this state and other places, we talk about this because I want them to be hopefully a better officer. That's how I do it.
Thank you. So one more personal question, then we have lots of questions. You know, we're an education institution, so I want to talk about the connection of your role in higher education, academia, and policing. But you know, we've talked about this a lot tonight. There's no question that our present moment is a challenging one. Who do you look to as a leader and inspiration right now?
Well, let me start, because it started number one with my dad. But for me, there's this incredible person called Colin Powell, you know, who I had the pleasure of meeting and talking with him. And we talked about these things. Here's this man who was a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who was a 4-star general and so forth. And we talked about some of the things that he went through in the Army. And Secretary of State. And we smiled because we had similar experiences in different locations. He is a person that I see as a true American hero. But there are others too. I mean, it's not just people of color. I mean, there's so many people who really try to make a difference and treat people with dignity and respect. Those are the people that I see. And if they say something that is profound, because I tell people, look for your hero. Look for a person that's going to make a difference with your life. And I've done that, continue to do that to this day. It's made a difference for me.
So I'm going to read this question. So it's from one of our K-12 educators. And they're asking, you know, in your experience, and you work a lot with both educators and law enforcement agencies, how do you see K-12 educators, and particularly white educators, effectively and compassionately addressing issues around race, police presence in schools, the school to prison pipeline? What role do they play, or how can they effectively address some of these issues? And what do you think are sort of the indicators of success for the role that teachers should have in this work, sort of the integration of the K-12 system and sort of mitigating some of these longer term impacts of systemic racism that you've identified?
I think educators, whether it's grade school, high school, or even the university, you have a profound impact upon people's lives, and telling them the truth about what's happening and getting them to feel positive about themselves. I have a teacher that was my 7th and 8th grade teacher. He is 95 years old to this day, and we're still in contact. I have another teacher who's 91 years old, and we're still in contact because of the impact they had on my life. And I say this to educators. You know, these young people are looking up to you for what you are and have done to make a difference in their lives. And I think that in particular for whatever race you might be, because I have white teachers who were my teachers in grade school or junior high school and high school, who had a profound impact upon my life, because the way that you approach that child will make a difference with him or her. And I remember I was when I was chief. It was 1994. I was at this restaurant having lunch with a person, and this man came up to me. He's white. He says, "Chief?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Chief McKinnon?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You were one of my students in high school." I said, "Oh God." And I said his name. I said, "Oh God, thank you." He said, no. He's, "Listen, you stood out in high school. Now you're standing out more as the police chief." He said, I'm going to tell all my friends that you were my student and you remembered me." I said, "Of course I remember you." But those are kinds of things that to me have a profound impact, not only on your life, but I think a teacher remembering me when I was 15 or 16, and I was 51 years old at the time. So there was obviously an impression that was made on both sides of us. But what they did for me to help shape my life and to make rational and impartial decisions about life.
Yeah, thank. So you've been a professor of education. You're in higher education now. You work in consulting. So how have you applied sort of the principles of academia, your the work that you do teaching to policing, and what principles did you learn in your sort of law enforcement career have you applied to your teaching in academia?
Having a good conversation with the young people in particular. And in fact, so many of my former students are still in touch with me. I have students who are living in Germany, students who are living in South Africa, students living in Canada, and around this country who stay in touch with me. They will call me, they have my cell number. "Dr. McKinnon, I want to talk with you about something." And we will do so. And so to me, that's the essence of education and being the kind of person that will talk to your students or talk to young people. It's not just people in the street, but getting them to understand. I'm talking about professors now, understand that they're young people who really want to learn, and we can be that conduit for them to make a difference in their lives.
Thank you. So we have some students here. We have a police academy at Grand Valley too. We have some students who are wondering, given some of the critical points in the profession, why would somebody go into law enforcement today? And in particular, why would a person of color go into law enforcement today?
Because we really need you. I mean, we really need not only people of color, but we need good people to go into that field, and they can serve this community. It's like, why would a person go into the military? Well, they want to protect our country, but we also need people who have the right mind, who want to serve and protect the people of a respective community and do it the right way. Because at this point, we don't have enough. And if people like us of the right mind don't do the right things with their respective community, it's not going to work. And that's why, I mean, salary is not great until you become chief. No, I'm just, but no, to serve your community, because we really need good people.
And a final question for me. So, and I want to thank you for all the time you spent with us. So, these are deep-seated, long history behind this entrenched, racialized and racist history in the United States and all of our institutions, not just policing. Are you optimistic that things can change? And are you optimistic that things can change quickly? Can you share some thoughts on that?
I'm a very optimistic person. I'm optimistic to the point of saying, I would hope that things would change quickly, but it's not going to, because in our country and the world, but in particular our country, we have a great number of differences and people not accepting and wanting to do something about those differences. I mean, when you go to places and people treat you differently because of the color of your skin or whatever it might be. But by us talking, by us doing everything that we can to make people feel as if they are part an integral part of our respective communities and yet the country. That I see as something that's positive. We can't continue to deny that there are problems that exist. We can't continue to say that there are these racial problems that exist within law enforcement. We can't continue to do that. And once we accept that, and then we step into, well, this is what happened. Now, let's try and make sure that everyone is treated equally. But the conversations are the main things. You just can't imagine the number of places that I've been to and had this same conversation with people, and people who are writing me and wanting to talk with me and say, thank you for the conversations we've had, because it's so important for all of us. This is the United States of America. It's not the United States of one America or two Americas, this is the United States of America. And we all have to stand up and speak out and fight for the beliefs within our country. Someone was on TV the other day talking about the Constitution of the United States. And I would advise people to start, number one, and read the preamble to the Constitution. We had to learn that, I think, in the second or third grade. But also to go online and read the Law Enforcement Code of Conduct, Law Enforcement Code of Ethics. And this is what law enforcement officers are supposed to do to make sure that they're doing the right job. And once in the academy, they should have people like myself and others. They don't have to be people of color, but people who talk to them about the reality of what they'll face out there and how they should treat people. I think once we do that, then we can all have a feeling that things are going to get better. They are getting better, because I'm 77 years old, and I still feel that there are great things that are going to happen. I really do.
Thank you. Before I turn it over to Jacob, I want to acknowledge and apologize to the many people who we did not get to your questions. You really popular, Dr. McKinnon. There were lots of questions, so I'm sorry we weren't able to get to them in this time. But it's been great. It's been an honor to talk to you. Thank you, Dr. McKinnon. I'll turn it over to Jacob. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Chief McKinnon and Vice President Bernal, for that thoughtful and very engaging discussion. And thank you to those that submitted questions, and echoing Jesse's sentiments there that, yes, the questions that we didn't get to, I might email Chief McKinnon so he can answer those.
That's a great idea. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. So after this meeting ends, a link will pop open with a survey for this evening's event. Please fill that out and let us know what you thought of the event, and give us feedback for future events as well. Nominations and applications for the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy are now open, and they will close on February 22nd. If you or a student you know is interested, you can find more information on our website at www.gbsu.edu/HC. Don't forget to join us on Thursday, February 18th at 7 p.m. when Monticello's own Bill Barker, the nation's foremost Thomas Jefferson interpreter, joins us for a President's Day celebration. Once again, thank you all for joining us this evening, and have a good night.